Hi everyone and welcome to Great Western, and in this edition we are going to be exploring the Grateful Dead. That manic opening sequence that you just heard was perhaps the first time that many people heard the Grateful Dead on record. It was the first track of their debut album, and the track was called The Golden Road to Unlimited Devotion. In many ways, it's not a typical Grateful Dead track, but it does have that anarchic late 60s psychedelic garage punk groove, and it's an absolute smash. However, this wasn't really the beginning of the Grateful Dead. Those in the know had been listening to the band for the previous couple of years when they began as the Warlocks in Palo Alto on the outskirts of San Francisco in California. Yes, folks, the Grateful Dead is very much a California band, and quite specifically a Northern California band, a San Francisco band. And that appears to have given them some unique quirks and foibles and a unique musical identity to call their very own. Albums always shifted in respectable numbers, particularly their many live albums. And by the end of 1974, they were arguably one of the biggest musical live bands in the United States. They did also have a small following in Europe and no doubt in other countries around the world. But it was in the United States that they really left their legacy. The band went on a break and played sporadically throughout the mid to late 1970s, and then reformed for another series of albums, and continued in that vein of album and tour pretty much until the end of the band in 1995. It's funny to say it, but probably one of the most famous incarnations of the band is an ice cream flavour. Ben and Jerry's Cherry Garcia is named after the band's leader and stellar guitarist Jerry Garcia. And what's he known for? Again, I couldn't point you towards any specific songs that you might have heard of necessarily. But if you've ever listened to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young and their 1970 LP Deja Vu, well, Jerry is all over Graham Nash's Teach Your Children, playing wonderful pedal steel guitar, something he did a lot of around that time in the early 1970s. In the 1980s and the age of MTV and video, the band had a huge comeback hit, but again in the United States, with a song called Touch of Grey, written by Jerry and his erstwhile songsmith and lyricist Robert Hunter, from the album In the Dark. Again, in the United Kingdom, it wasn't widely known. So this uniquely Californian, San Francisco psychedelic band couldn't have got to where it got to without some key collaborators. There were essentially 5 or 6 main players in the Grateful Dead, and they were unusual because they had musical collaborators who didn't appear on stage or on recordings. Jerry Garcia mainly worked with the poet and lyricist and mystic Robert Hunter, whereas rhythm guitarist Bob Weir generally worked with John Perry Barlow. who became something of an internet pioneer, philosopher, and all-round free thinker. So something that the Grateful Dead are known for are their very poetic lyrics created by Hunter and Barlow. And these lyrics present an interesting view of life, a very non-judgmental, non-authoritarian way of life, and frequently they summon up a lost America, an Americana of the Wild West, of pioneers, of loners and chancers and gamblers and people with a whole load of problems. That is another unique flavour of Grateful Dead lyrics. But they aren't all like that. There are upbeat rockers and all sorts of other different tracks. But a lot of the things, particularly written by Hunter and Garcia, do tend to summon up a sort of lost, mysterious world of America that perhaps never even existed. Other key collaborators were various members of the San Francisco band Jefferson Airplane, who went on to become Starship, and David Crosby of course, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, was an influence on Jerry Garcia. Jerry played on David's 1971 album, If I Could Only Remember My Name. And that album's soundscape and texture is very similar to what the Grateful Dead were recording at that time. I have to say, it's some wonderful, wonderful music. Jerry Garcia was always busy and he always had side projects going. The New Riders of the Purple Sage, Old and in the Way, the Legion of Mary, and perhaps more simply, the Jerry Garcia Band. So he was constantly touring in different permutations of musicians, usually in the United States, which just seems to emphasize the fact that this is a very American phenomena. In Don Henley's hit Boys of Summer, he mentions a Deadheads sticker on a Cadillac. That's a juxtaposition of a fancy car with a counterculture symbol, and the Deadheads with a Grateful Dead's fan base. Some of them actually followed them from concert to concert on a tour. Such was their level of dedication. Throughout the 1980s, wherever the band played, informal marketplaces would set up outside the venue. These were often called Shakedown Street, after one of their late 70s albums. And these were very dedicated, committed people. The band were pioneers of taping and cataloguing of gigs. You can go online and find perhaps nearly every concert that they'd ever played, in varying qualities, of course. And the band didn't have a problem with that sort of copyright violation. In fact, they almost encouraged people to tape the gigs. So there are the Deadheads. So the Grateful Dead are really interesting because they created a community of people who had their ethos and did the things that the Grateful Dead would do. And there's not a lot of bands that can say that they've actually developed a whole legion of fans who were very much in the image of the band. So here are some unusual facts about a band that was around for 30 years. And in 30 years, things aren't just run-of-the-mill, are they? First of all, for most of its life, the band had two drummers, Bill Kreutzmann and Mickey Hart. Sadly, tragically, all the main keyboard players in the band died young or in tragic circumstances. That is like the movie Spinal Tap in real life, unfortunately. Where did the band's name come from? It's very distinctive. Well, in the spirit of the band, a band that thrived on coincidence, and Revelations. The name was found at random in a folklore dictionary. The Grateful Dead weren't always served well by managers. Mickey Hart's father, Lenny Hart, ripped the band off and disappeared, and this led to Mickey Hart leaving the band for a period of about 5 years. But he eventually was reintegrated and became an important part of the band throughout the 1980s and 90s. I've tried to encapsulate some of the things that the Grateful Dead were, but there's some things that they weren't as well. First of all, although he was regarded as their leader, Jerry Garcia did not seek fame and fortune. He lived for the music. He didn't particularly like leading the band. He didn't like being in the public eye. He didn't like publicity. And he didn't like lots of questions and things. Although he was interviewed and often came across as very genial and very humble. The Grateful Dead were not a fame machine. Music-wise, they were possibly unsurpassed, but they weren't great singers. In the early 70s, they did get their chops together and produced some excellent harmonies on the album Working Man's Dead and its swift follow-up American Beauty. I think there was a huge influence there from Crosby, Stills and Nash, so they really worked at it. But in general, they were not strong singers. Something else the band were not going to do, they weren't going to tell you how to live your life. Yes, they were very relaxed. Yes, drugs were often involved. But politics didn't play a big part in their worldview. They did play a handful of benefits for different sorts of perhaps political charities and pressure groups, but politics was not a big part of their thing, and I personally find that very refreshing because a lot of the music that I listen to doesn't align with my political values very closely at all. And here was a band who were not prepared to tell me how to vote or to tell me how to live my life. And in that sense, I think the Grateful Dead is really, really refreshing. It's time to talk a bit more about the central pivot of the band, Jerry Garcia. And because of the length of this video, I'm afraid I'm going to have to focus on the sad things. Jerry died at the age of 53 on the 9th of August 1995. And yes, I do remember it, and yes, it was very much over the UK music press. But at the time, I still wasn't really particularly aware of the band. But it was clearly a sad loss to many. 53 is pretty young, and Jerry's health had been in decline since the late 70s. Throughout the 70s, he was arguably doing his most imaginative, greatest work. In the 80s, he was still good. The band's albums were okay, and they did have that 1987 hit. And then into the 90s, the band was still a very attractive live proposition, but it could be argued that the band's best days were behind it. Jerry was a periodic heroin user. I've mentioned his side projects, all the different bands that he had going. He was certainly guilty of overwork, and he had a poor diet. This was a busy man who felt the pressure of the band and all the people associated with the band, the loyal family of roadies, managers, accountants, and family members, all of whom, in some respects, were relying on Jerry and the financial clout of the band to keep them in work, to keep them in food, to keep them with a mortgage and a roof over their head. And there's no doubt that he felt that huge pressure to continue touring and to continue producing music. A couple of months after Jerry's death, it was somewhat inevitably announced that the Grateful Dead were no more. And since that time, they have played a few concerts in various guises, but they have kept their word and the band has never reformed. Sadly, in 2024, bassist Phil Lesh also passed away. Underneath this video, I am including links to various music and resources that will help you understand more about the Grateful Dead, and I hope get you up to speed very quickly. First of all, I'm indebted to Blair Jackson for Garcia, An American Life, which is available on Kindle and no doubt in paperback. That is a perfect introduction to Jerry Garcia, and it also contains a very good history of the band along the way. So that would be my starting point. Music-wise, I'm including links to live versions of Scarlet, Begonias, Morning Dew and St. Stephen, 3 excellent mid-70s Grateful Dead performances, and also to give you a flavour of Jerry's more experimental side, I'm including a link to a 1980 performance of Dear Prudence at the Capitol Theatre in New York with Jerry and the Jerry Garcia Band. So, I hope, like me, you enjoy journeying with the Grateful Dead and that their music takes you to some beautiful places. Thank you for watching. Thank you so much for watching Great Western. Please, if you've enjoyed this video, like and consider subscribing to this channel. Your likes and subscription will encourage me and help build this brand and open up more of my insights into the world of music, television, tech and more. Thank you for watching.